Hi everybody and thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to talk to you about all the steps leading up to the event where our modern day United States or the Americans gain freedom from who they used to be a part of, Great Britain. And I'm going to do this through screen sharing with some images and some explanation. So let's get started. The very first funneling of what started people getting mad and creating the American Revolutionary War was actually another war called the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War is fought over territories within what's now modern day the United States. And basically what happened is there's two countries that claim parts of the United States, which is modern day United States, Great Britain and France. So obviously if two countries are claiming the same piece of land, they go to war to decide who gets the land. So the France begins to partner up with Native Americans that are living in the territories to help fight against the Britain. And this actually goes to their advantage because they begin to use different battle tactics. So back then, the British would use a battle tactic where they'd stand in straight lines, they'd fire on command, where the Indians and now the French begin to use different type of tactics, such as hiding behind trees and sneaking around, which the British weren't prepared for, which caused them to lose several of their wars. Little fun fact, one of the main leaders or generals in the French and Indian War was General Washington, who becomes a very important leader in the Patriot fighting to gain our independence. So first battle actually was run by George Washington. He loses. Second battle, lost. Several more battles, lots of losses. But finally, the British take over this area and they force France to sign the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which surrenders all of the French claim on what is modern day United States. So this is the first part of the war, or part of the argument with the colonists, because wars are extremely expensive and they have to find a way to pay for this. So this is when King George III, who's the head of Britain, says, we're going to push through what's called the Proclamation of 1763. And this says, pulling back up my map, that they don't want the colonists are actually afraid of Indians right now because they keep settling on Indian land or Indian territory, which is making the Indians mad. So they said, don't go past the Appalachian Mountains or the Ohio River Valley. And I'm tried drawing approximately where that would be. It's not at all historically accurate, but that's about where it would be. They said, don't go there. And this makes colonists furious because a lot of them already live right next to this valley. And they're mad because they are supposed to, according to this proclamation of 1763, they have to move. And they are like, no way, I am not moving. So another act is pushed through, which also makes the colonists mad. And this is called the Sugar Act. And basically, like I said, wars are extremely expensive and we have to find a way to pay for it. So King George says that every pound of sugar you buy, you have to pay 3 pence. And 3 pence is their form of currency or money at the time because they didn't have the US dollar yet. So they said 3 pence per pound of sugar. And this infuriates the colonists because they want to say as to whether they're going to have to pay these taxes or not. So this famous phrase begins to be said over and over again in the colonists: no taxation without representation. And what this means is they don't want to be taxed unless they have a say or a part in the British Parliament. British Parliament is their form of government back then. And they actually use the Parliament today. So they get mad. This actually ends up being rescinded because the Americans or the colonists back then refused to pay it. So King George, still trying to pay for this French and Indian War, pushes through what's called the Stamp Act. And this is making them even more mad because this act actually has 2 parts of it. So this part now says that British soldiers are now going to be occupied in the colonies. So British soldiers are just going to be up on the streets doing what they want to do, and the Americans, the colonists, can do nothing. And it also begins to tax very important documents, papers, newspapers, playing cards, And this makes the colonists very mad. They don't want to pay these taxes. So this is actually the first form of meeting together to talk about this. 9 different colonies meet in New York, and they call themselves the Stamp Act Congress, and they discuss that they don't like this act and they're not paying it. So this ultimately ends up in an angry mob destroying some of the stamps, which repeals or gets rid of this act. So then this does not work. So we need to find something else. Well, at this point, people are getting mad, and the colonists are getting extremely mad, and they want to talk about why they're mad and what's going on. So they form what's called a Committee of Correspondence. And the Committee of Correspondence, there's one for each of the colonies, is a way of communicating. Because think about nowadays, we can just, send a text message, hey, the British are here, we don't like it. Versus back then, they had to send a letter, and the letters would sometimes get lost or things would happen. So they wanted a straight chain of messaging to get around so that they could talk about what's going on and fix these problems. So the very first Committee of Correspondence was formed by Samuel Adams, pictured here, and his group. He was a famous patriot for forming the group Sons of Liberty. And this forms the first chain of communication with the colonists saying, we don't like this, we can talk about it. But King George is up to new stuff, and he begins to send another tax, which of course angers the colonists. This is called the Townshend-Acts. Okay, the Townshend-Acts are a various amount of taxes that are proposed on items such as paint, paper, glass, and tea. This infuriates the colonists. So they begin to say, we're not buying it. We're not paying this tax, which ultimately ends up in the British losing money because the Americans, the colonists, won't pay the tax on their items, and they won't even purchase the items because they're not paying the tax on it. So King George realizes that he's losing money because of this act. So he says, okay, fine, Americans or colonists, I will get rid of the Townshend-Acts, but you still have to pay a tax on tea. So, of course, the Americans are still mad that they have to pay tax on tea, but this act is rescinded. The next step in our line is a very, very important one. It's called the Boston Massacre. And I'm sure you've heard of this one. It's super famous. So with the Boston Massacre, let me pull up the picture. I think we've even looked at this picture in class a couple times. There we go. So the Boston Massacre takes place in the downtown streets of Boston, where a group of angry colonists begin to throw rocks and snowballs and sticks at British army or British soldiers stationed in Boston. They begin to call them lobster scoundrels and create kind of a ruckus. So within this ruckus, one British soldier ends up firing a shot. And the leader of the British he keeps saying, hold your fire, but this does not happen, and shots are ring out through the crowd. And when the smoke clears, it is found that 5 colonists, I should say, are dead. Oopsies, let me write that down real fast. And this infuriates. This is really what sets the ball rolling for the British and Americans to break apart from each other, because they kept saying it's a massacre. The British killed hundreds of soldiers or hundreds of colonists. They made a huge deal about this. So what ultimately happens is that John Adams, so they get some of these soldiers to go to court to fess up for their sins, and John Adams defends the soldiers. And during this court case, 6 of the soldiers are found innocent, and 2 are branded on their thumb for manslaughter. But ultimately, the goal of and what happened with the Boston Massacre is that it infuriated colonists. And this infuriation caused another famous part of the road to independence is the Tea Act or the Boston Tea Party. And what happens here is King George says, you can only buy tea from the East India Trading Company, which is the British Tea Company. And this is actually a symbol that they wouldn't brand on their boxes of tea back from that time. So basically he says you can only buy tea from the East India Trading Company. And this makes colonists mad because they don't want a monopoly on their tea. So they refuse the tea. They send ships full of tea that made the journey from Britain to America on a ship. They send them back. They say, we don't want the tea, go back. And in Charleston, North Carolina, they actually leave the tea on the beach or the harbor to rot. They do not want this tea. So what ultimately ends up happening is what's called the Boston Tea Party, where 60 colonists dress up as Indians and board a ship full of tea in the Boston harbor. And these colonists take 362 crates of tea and throw it into the harbor, destroying all the tea. This makes King George furious because they lost a lot of money on the tea. So he pushes through an act that he thinks is going to really get the colonists, and it's called the Corvick Acts. Oops, let me make sure I got this up here right. Coerci, which is actually ends up being renamed by the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, because intolerable means unbearable, and they think this is absolutely unbearable. The first thing they do is they close Boston Harbor. So they say no imports, no exports, which kills part of the colonist economy because they can't send anything, they can't receive anything. They actually do this by sending British warships to hold and defend the harbor. And then they say that the colony of Massachusetts no longer gets to meet. That instead, the British are going to run the government. This makes them extremely mad. But then the icing on the cake with the Intolerable Acts is that they make a new law saying that anybody in the colonies can be subjected to having a British soldier show up and just live in their house. And you have to feed them, you have to take care of them, and you have to give them a bed. This was called the Quartering Act. And this really fuels the fire. This is like the icing on the cake. We're getting right pretty close to the American Revolution at this point because no one wants the harbor closed. They're upset because Massachusetts no longer is allowed to run their own government. And the Quartering Act forces colonists to have to allow British soldiers to live in their home. So the Americans, or I'm sorry, I keep saying Americans, I mean colonists, they become Americans at the end, need to talk about this. So they form the First Continental Congress. And this is held in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. And out of all of the 13 colonies, 12 of them show up with the exemption of Georgia not coming. And there is some extremely important people that show up to this meeting, including General Washington and John Adams, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams. All these important people are here, and they decide to meet and discuss what do we do about this tyrant, King George III. So what they do is they form what's called a petition. And a petition is like a group of complaints saying, if we don't like this, this is what we want you to do. So the first thing they said, this is super important, is we are still loyal to you. So they said at this point, we still want to be loyal, but we want no taxation without representation. We want a say in our government. If you're going to do something, we want to say it. That's only fair. King George ignores this, which is a bad move on his part because this is what sets the first battles in the war. So the first battles in the war, which is still considered the road to independence because this is a pretty important part, but I would still say it's part of the road and not actually part of the war, maybe like a middle of the two, is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So the Battle of Lexington and Concord started when, remember I said Massachusetts is no longer allowed to have any say in their own government. Instead, they send this guy here named Thomas Gage, and his job is to run the Massachusetts government. And he's first charged with having to find notorious patriots, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who are supposedly hanging out in Lexington, the city of Lexington, and he has to find them. And then he should head over to Concord, where he's told that there is a supply of ammunitions and guns and ammo that the colonists are hiding, and he should take all their ammunition and take all their ammunition from the colonists. So Paul Revere, this is where that famous saying, so basically what's happening is he needs to capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams, and he needs to get all of the colonist gun supply from Concord. So in order to prevent this from happening, the redcoats are coming, Paul Revere goes through towns to make sure he tells people. I don't think he actually screamed the redcoats are coming because people might have heard him and that wouldn't have been good, but he gets the word out that redcoats are coming. So the first battle begins in Lexington. So this is when British soldiers reach Lexington. And what happens here is completely sad. So the British get there, and the Americans only have 70 people ready to fight to Britain's 700. So ultimately this ends in a small fight here where 8 people die, and of all those 8, it's the colonists that lose, the 8 people. So they go through Lexington, these 8 people die, and then they march on their way to Concord, where they're told that all that ammunition is waiting. So remember, Paul Revere, redcoats are coming. Word got around, so the colonists moved a lot of their ammunition and guns, or they destroyed it because they did not want the British to have it. So they get to the Concord, and a fight breaks out between the colonists and British, which is famously, this battle is known as the shots heard around the world. If you've ever heard that phrase before, it comes from the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And they search for these guns and ammunition, they take what they find, and then they march on their way to Boston. So their final battle is ending in Boston. And at this point, colonists are getting word that the British are here, they're taking our stuff, we need to act fast. So the Americans, or the colonists, end up forming 2,000 or more people, and a battle breaks out. So basically what happens is they're hiding behind walls and trees, and as the British are marching from Concord to Boston, this 18-mile stretch, the colonists are just firing at them as they walk, and it ends up resulting in a pretty interesting total here. So after all this, so they're on their way to Boston, the colonists are firing at them. It ends up in 250 redcoats being the British, being injured or killed. And the Americans, or the colonists, only had 90. So this really leads, King George to understanding that the colonists are serious, and you need to start taking them seriously or we're going to war, which obviously you can anticipate what happens next. They go to war. But thank you for listening to me. I really appreciate all your time. Have a good rest of your day.